In this morning's gospel, we heard the story of the call of Simon Peter, the fisherman, and how Peter encounters Jesus. Luke tells us that the crowd was pressing in on Jesus and listening to the word of God. So Jesus got into Peter's boat and asked him to pull out a short way. After he finished teaching the crowds, Jesus said to Peter, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Peter then responded, "Master, we have worked hard all night and have caught nothing. But at your command, I will lower the nets." I am positive that Peter and his crew must have been exhausted from a full night of catching nothing. They were probably more than ready to go home. And we too could respond the same way when Jesus asks us to make certain decisions in our lives. We also can reject his word and follow our own instincts. But not Peter. Peter decided to obey Jesus, to take a chance and put out into the deep and lower the nets, to run a small risk, to ignore his overwhelming fatigue and the possible threat of ridicule among his co-workers and friends. So they obeyed Jesus, rowed out into the deep water, and let down the nets. We all know what happens next. The nets are so full of fish that they began to break. Boats so full of fish that they began to sink. Seeing what was happening, Simon was overwhelmed with fear and wonder, sensing that he was in the presence of divine power. He responded by falling down at Jesus' knees and begged him, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Simon was caught by surprise. In the midst of his ordinary daily work, he was encountered by the one who changes everything. Amazed by the power of God displayed in the abundant catch of fish, Simon is immediately aware of his sinfulness and unworthiness. He sees the overwhelming disparity between God's power manifest in Jesus and his own mortal, compromised life. In today's Old Testament reading, we also heard that the prophet Isaiah was in the presence of God and was being called by God to take a message to God's people. Isaiah protested and said, "Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Both Isaiah and Peter felt the magnitude of their unworthiness. A seraph cleansed Isaiah's lips with a burning coal, and Jesus had a cleansing word for Peter. After Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send?" Like Isaiah's decision to follow the Lord, didn't read it right. After Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go with us?" And he answered, "Here I am, send me." Like Isaiah's decision to follow the Lord, Peter, James, John, and the others decided to follow Jesus. They dropped everything they were doing, walked away from their possessions and families, and followed him. And so what do we have to leave behind to follow Jesus? After all, Jesus' behavior and actions provide the perfect model for us. He went out among the people, into the street where they lived, worked, experiencing joy and sorrow in all the messiness of their lives. One example would be Agnes Bojacu, who was born in Macedonia in 1910. At the tender age of 12, she strongly felt the call of God and knew she was called to spread the love of Jesus Christ. At the age of 18, she entered a convent and joined the Sisters of Loretto. While teaching at a high school in Calcutta, she was so moved by the extreme poverty she saw from her window that she sought and received permission to work among the poorest of poor in the slums. The story of her work became well known to all because this woman that we all knew was Mother Teresa. And she continued obediently to answer God's call to serve God's people until her death. I know that there are thousands of stories about people who have received calls to a radical vocation. But the fact is, God calls us all to follow him today, just as certainly as Jesus called Peter, James, and John. The important thing is to recognize that God's work of calling did not stop with the gospel stories. God's calling to us continues to this day. God has already ordered things so that the call is just one more piece in God's puzzle. That was surely the case with Peter, James, and John. When Jesus commanded them to follow him, the events surrounding their lives had already been perfectly ordered to support their response. And so how do we respond? Just as Jesus involved himself in Peter's everyday concerns about fishing, God calls to each of us in our ordinary, everyday lives and asks that we follow him. Sometimes that call is a radical vocation, and sometimes it is a call to feed God's sheep right where we are, in our families, at work, in our church, and in our communities. I would like to call your attention to the board that's in front of the church here. I know many of you have seen it in the parish hall, and we've talked about it from time to time, but with the pandemic, we kind of got away from it a little bit, so the total ministry team decided, no, we need to call our attention and remind each other about what we're doing here and the meaning of that board and how important it is. So if you look at the board, you will see many post-it notes in yellow, orange, and green. These post-it notes, depending on the color, are showing where members of our church are discerning or have answered God's call here at St. Patrick's. There are also many that have ministries that are outside of the church. Those are the ones that are on the far side in yellow. So for example, if some of you perhaps are involved with the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts or the Lions or whatever organization it may be, that is God's work out into the world. So we have that on the far right. The rest of it is all ministries that we have identified here at St. Patrick's, and there's many ministries up there. One of the things I did this morning was concentrated a little bit on school. Marcia is our person that coordinates the timesheets that we turn in, and I was quite amazed to see what we accomplished last year besides, or because, not because of the pandemic, in spite of the pandemic. We have 14 people in this church who volunteer as school volunteers who will do such things as make phone calls to those who are living alone or maybe who are ill, driving people to the doctors, taking food to people, whatever the need may be. We've even had some that have done some light housekeeping and so forth. And during the pandemic, some of that was a little bit more difficult, but we did it nonetheless. And if my memory serves me right, on that board, those of you who are volunteers for school put in 84 hours last year. So I think that's pretty phenomenal. And we have 12 clients that we serve, and we put a lot of miles on our cars if we're taking them to the doctor, so the mileage is on there. And the time that we put in to make life a little bit better for those who are our clients. And our goal is to keep them as independent as possible. No one wants to end up in a nursing home or even an independent living situation. We want to stay in our homes. And so that's the goal of Interfaith Volunteer Caregivers under which we operate. We call ourselves School St. Patrick's Offering Our Love. There's all other kinds of ministries on there too. Doesn't have to be priests, but we're blessed with 2 priests. We have people who serve hospitality, all different kinds of ministries in the church. Prayer chain, choir. The list, if you look at that board, we may be a little church, but there's a lot going on here. I'd like to ask Inga and Dave if they'll turn the board around. And the top of the board there, the sign says Worldwide Outreach. And all the little Post-it notes that are there are places in the world that have benefited from our outreach efforts. It could be the dresses that we made that were sent to countries in Africa and some of the Dominican Republic, Haiti, places like that. So young girls could have a dress to be able to go to school. We work with Episcopal Relief and Development, and we send money on a regular basis, and that money goes to various places all around the world. Pam has been the one that has been working with this board, and of course during the pandemic we kind of lost track of some of what we're doing, but our work has been done and it does continue. In fact, I had a letter today from ERD for the last donation that we made. So we're out there into the world. And any of you who are thinking and discerning maybe trying another ministry, you can see me and we can talk about the board and what ministry you're in. I know, Peggy, for example, you discerned and become a part of the choir, so we need to get you up there if you're not already up there. And you would get a green one because you're already doing the ministry.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about doing a ministry, then that's orange. And then Paul and I and Linda, we watch that to see who needs the training, if it's a worship leader or something like that. So keep up the good work. Linda's proud of you, Paul's proud of you, and so am I. And most of all, so is God. This call that we have is about community. Jesus still calls people to follow him. When we choose to follow him, we become living demonstrations of his love and can help others to learn to know him. Jesus' mission does not wait until we think we are ready. The need for the gospel in this broken world is far too urgent. We are called right now, even in spite of our frailty, failures, and doubts. Even in the midst of our ordinary, busy, complicated lives, Jesus' word to Simon Peter is also a word to us. Do not be afraid. This is Jesus' mission, and we trust that he will keep working with us and through us, catching others as he has caught us in the deep, wide net of God's mercy and love. We trust finally that the catch is in God's hands and that God's desire is for the nets to be bursting and the boats full. Let us pray. Jesus, you taught your disciples to cast a wide net, not for fish, but for people. Teach us the fishing craft. Make our fingers nimble so we may handle hearts and hands gently. Make our minds quiet and patient while we wait for those who are not yet ready to receive you. And make our hearts hungry for your word, for the sake of the one who has captured our hearts already, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.